Dark Souls 1, Dark Souls 3, Bloodborne, Sekiro's Shadows Die Twice, and the original Demon Souls all have one thing in common, and that's Hidetaka Miyazaki as game director. Now, am I gonna say he's the only reason these games are great? No. But is he a norm-sized reason? Well, if I'm going to be honest, it's the one huge ingredient that stays consistent across all the games that are considered great. He seems to know how to direct a game well, but let's focus on reasons that are different. How about the lack of solid direction during development? Having two directors rather than one, because originally Tomohiro Shibuya was the director of Dark Souls 2. Even though there was good intentions, they wanted to make the game better than the original in every way, and I agree that's a good thing. That's what you should want to do. You want to improve and best the game that comes before it. That's the natural progression a series should have. But the game ended up going through a very troubled development. They were trying to go for a more, as they put it, photorealistic looking open world style rather than the semi-open-ended design of the first game. They even created a new engine and everything to try to make it happen alongside having a deadline. But they were a bit too ambitious. They just kept running into technical issues between the new engine and the consoles at the time struggling with what they were throwing at it, and also the team was beginning to not like the direction Tomohiro Shibuya was taking the game, and so they dropped him as developer. And this changed the course of action entirely, which is not usually a good sign for a game when mid-development, a game takes a huge direction shift and redesign. But they realized the direction they were going in just wasn't working. It was too much for the current consoles and it wasn't the way they wanted to go with the game. But at this point in development, they only had a bit over a year to take this task on. So they began to shrink the scope and removed things like the open world aspect, very complex lighting system, and repurposed a lot of assets like bosses, NPCs, enemies, environments. And in my opinion, this is a big reason this game has a lot of the issues I'm going to discuss in this video. Also, that goes back to Miyazaki being a component in these games. He usually has a clear vision and a clear direction he wants to go and knows a good way to get it done. Shibuya had good intentions but lacked the clear direction in my opinion. I'm not stating fact here, but I also feel he lacked the understanding of what Dark Souls is meant to be. But then again, there was only Dark Souls 1 to go off of. But instead, he should have tried to tighten up and refine elements of Dark Souls rather than just make it bigger. But again, good intentions, bad execution. The new director only had a little over a year to reconfigure, maneuver, and rework this game to be what it is today. And in my opinion, for what it is, that's impressive, but it still doesn't make it a great Souls game. Let's quickly talk story, but not for long, because we all know the story is not what we all play these Souls games for. But I do like to cover the story in these videos. I mean, let's be honest, Souls games, when you dig into them, have a great lore and story behind them. Check out Vadi Vidya and his lore breakdowns for all From Software games and enjoy his buttery smooth voice and delivery. Now let's dig into it. You have the undead curse, and you have come to Drain Lake to break this curse, otherwise you are doomed to become hollow. The Emerald Herald tasks you with finding the 4 great souls and seek the king. You find that the king had failed his duties, putting it vaguely, and it's your job to take the throne and usher in the Age of Fire, or to usher in the Age of Darkness. Sound familiar? Yeah, it's not much different from the first game, and neither is the third game. But again, the overarching story isn't the interesting stuff. It's the lore surrounding the game that's interesting, like when you speak to characters or read item descriptions and stuff like that. It's the Miyazaki style, although Sekiro is more direct with its storytelling. But aside from that, From Software games have world storytelling rather than direct storytelling. But how is the world building in Dark Souls 2? Well, let's start by saying Dark Souls 1, Dark Souls 3, and Bloodborne all have worlds that feel believable and lived in, and you can put things together just by playing the game and never reading a thing. They're very immersive worlds that tell you the story without telling you anything, and that's something Dark Souls 2 Scholor the First Sin lacks. I don't feel connected to the world. I don't feel like it's believable world. It's not an interesting world. I even feel like characters are lacking the depth that characters in Dark Souls 1 have. I mean, think about how many memorable areas and characters there are in Dark Souls 1. You have Patches, you have Framp, you have Darkstalker Koth, the Crestfallen Knight, and who can forget to praise the sun with Solaire of Astora? And I'm naming these off from the top of my head while writing this. I can't remember a single character except for the Emerald Herald, the Blacksmith, Gavlan, and the Armor Dealer. And who was the Scorpion guy? Dwayne The Rock Johnson? What's his name? Oh yeah, Man Scorpion Tark. See my point? I had to Google his name. I also remember the Armor Dealer, but I don't remember the name without Googling it. But most of these characters, I remember them only because you see them the most. And I'm pulling at straws here. I will say Gavlan is a lovable character because he's a silly character compared to everything else. And the areas aren't memorable either. They're ugly and basic, but I'll discuss graphics later. But aside from a couple that are memorable and believable, most of the ones I do remember aren't for a good reason. Like Half-Baked Blighttown, who goes by the name of the Gutter. Super original, and it gets followed up with, in my opinion, what in some ways can be worse than Fair and Keep, and Blighttown's Poison Swamp. Not Blighttown's Descent, but just the swamp part. Hell, at least those places had character. But even though I would say Fair and Keep is a harder area, I hate Black Gulch, with its BS poison spewing statues that thankfully you can break, and the oil holes you have to burn to kill the creatures inside them, or else get snatched up by them. Aside from that area, there is one that's way worse I hate. I hate Shrine of Amana just as much as the worst poison swamp areas in the series. It forces a specific way of play. If you ain't dex enough, you'll struggle. This place is pure BS, unfair design, with multiple magic shooting enemies in any given spot and ground enemies nipping at your ankles. And to top it off, you need a torch. A torch, you might be wondering? Yeah, a torch. You need a torch if you don't feel like having your camera facing the ground the whole time, so you don't fall into holes. I hate it there. It's awful, and I think the boss at the end is also one of the weaker bosses in the series, so there's no payoff for the BS you've dealt with except for knowing you're done. At least at the end of Fair and Keep, you get one of the high tier boss battles with the Abyss Watchers. But before I say this, just know I haven't played most of the Chalice dungeons or the Old Hunters DLC in Bloodborne or either version of Demon Souls, but aside from those facts, I don't think any area from the Soulsborne series brings more hatred out of me than the Undead Crypt. Those stupid bells and ghostly pyromancers with the stupid enemies that always somehow ring that godforsaken bell over and over and over again, getting me killed. I hate this place more than Black Gulch, Blighttown, and Fair and Keep, and those are like my top 5 and top 10 most hated places. This whole game is riddled with terrible areas. Most Souls game areas feel balanced and fair, usually, and this game feels like it wants to piss you off, and this area is the epitome of that exact thing. F the Undead Crypt, F those bells, and F the rocks that make it worse. But what are some places I liked? Are there any memorable enough in a positive way? Well, yes, but not as memorable as any areas in the rest of the series. My all-time favorite area in this game, look-wise, and mostly design-wise, would be Dragon Ari, or Dragon Eyrie, I'm not quite sure how to pronounce it. With the dragons flying around the sky, and the rickety-looking bridges, and the badass feeling of barging into dragons sleeping, and being a badass dragon slayer, or a stealthy rogue sneaking around for the treasures. Although the explosive hollows do detract from this slightly. Again, F the player, right? But I love the part of the Dragon Ari where you are crossing the bridge to the castle, and on a first playthrough, it's nerve-wracking. It gets all cinematic where you don't know if a dragon's gonna swoop down and attack you or not, and then BAM! If you aren't fast enough, a big dragon drops down, snaps the bridge, and kills you. I love that, and I love the design of the Iron Keep, but the enemy layout doesn't make it a great area, but it is memorable. More on this later. Who could possibly forget Drain Lake Castle with the beautiful lighting and rain soaking the architecture, making the light glisten off the concrete, and the walk from the castle through King's Passage with the flashing lightning lighting up the hall, making the walk up to Looking Glass Knight, which is among my favorite bosses in the Dark Souls 2. A tense and dramatic build-up. I also like the area Heights Tower of Flame, even if some of the enemy placement is questionable, but that's about it when it comes to being memorable to me. But why is that, you might ask? And it's because they leave an impression on you. Your list of areas might be different than mine, and that's fine, but I feel that the rest of the game has a bit of generic design to it. DS1 and DS3, most of the areas have things that make them stand out and distinct and impressionable, and I'll go as far as to say that Dark Souls 2 looks worse than Dark Souls 1, and I think that has a part in it. Even unfinished areas in Dark Souls 1 like Lost Izalith and Demon Ruins, they are very striking, and yes, I know that Lost Izalith has problems, with the lava making the area a bit unfair, but when you just look at the areas, it's still impressionable on you. How about Ash Lake, an area off behind several illusory walls? Its beautiful seascape with giant trees and light fog, with a giant hydra and ancient dragon at the end that you can speak to or even rip the tail off just to get a weapon, or the great hollow before it. How about the painted world of Ariamis, another area some players will miss because it's in a painting inside Anor Londo? Or how about Sen's Fortress with its crazy interior with crazy traps and obstacles and lizard people guards and a giant on top, dropping boulders and throwing bombs on the roof, and you finish by fighting a giant golem to show you're worthy of Anor Londo. And that's another area that everyone remembers fondly. It's made to be such a big deal when you see it. It's beautiful. It's more beautiful than any of the best looking areas in Dark Souls 2. It leaves such a big impression on you. And it ends with the best boss duo in Souls history, Ornstein and Smo. I could do this all afternoon, and that's just Dark Souls 1. Are you seeing what I'm getting at? Dark Souls 2 doesn't have this effect on people. It doesn't have the star power behind its areas. They're dry and generic and hard to look at. So let's talk about why I keep saying they're so ugly. The graphics. I feel a third of the game is gorgeous and the other 2/3 look worse than Dark Souls 1. It's very inconsistent with its graphics. I know it's going for a gray dying world, but so was DS3. How Bloodborne is all blacks and grays. But it is more than that. The texture work in some areas is just bad, even for Xbox 360 or PS3 game, and even worse for a PS4 or Xbox One game. And lighting is inconsistent. The lighting in Dragonlink Castle, Majula, Hyde's Tower of Flame, and during the fights of Looking Glass Knight, Demon of Song, and the Flexile Sentry, and like 2 others look phenomenal. It looks gorgeous, but looks horrible everywhere else. There's either no lighting, or it's so flat the PS2 would blush. Textures look super gross sometimes, like here in this hall of Forest of Fallen Giants, and this tree bark, and I think the whole area of Harvest Valley looks really bad. Same with the foresty areas of Huntsman Copse, or Earthen Peak. It just all looks bad, and also leans on my point of lighting being bad in these areas. And to make matters worse, they advertise this game to have such dynamic lighting, but as we all know, the development ruined that. But damn, this is bad. But I don't know. I think it contributes to the idea of areas not being memorable, because they all look flat and uninteresting. Again, 90% of Dark Souls 1 looks a hell of a lot better than Dark Souls 2 Scholar of the First Sin Edition. And now we have Dark Souls 1 Remastered. Also, at no point have I been talking about the PS3 or Xbox 360 editions of Dark Souls 2. This is strictly about the PS4 version. But let's get to what I think breaks this game for Dark Souls veterans and fans of the series, and that is the gameplay. In this game's F the player attitude. Let's start by pointing out exactly how bad this F the player attitude is. Where it went as far as to take your damn iframes away and attaching it to a stupid thing you have to level up called adaptability. The stat itself for iframes is called agility. And without googling this, you wouldn't know. You would just think this game has worse iframes, and that's just how it is. Vehement from the future here. I forgot to explain what an iframe is. So if you're not aware what an iframe is, an iframe is how many frames you have invincibility. It's an invincibility frame. So how many frames of your roll are you invincible? So from the moment you start rolling to the moment you no longer are invincible. Smaller amount of iframes, the less time during that roll are you invincible. The more iframes, the more time during that roll you're invincible. So say here's my roll, right? Here's where I'm going to start. Here's where I'm going to end. I got iframes, and say my iframes stop here. This part of my roll, I'm no longer invincible. And the less iframes, the less of your roll are you invincible. That's why it's super important. Iframes are an integral part of Dark Souls' combat. You know, when you dodge roll, you dodge through attacks, around attacks. Iframes are very, very important. And that's why it's such a big deal that they take away iframes and make it so confusing and convoluted to get iframes. So that ruins it for a lot of people who wouldn't even think to look into this. They just think, oh, okay, this is already worse than Dark Souls 1. Or new players starting here thinks this is just how Dark Souls games are. And that's just not the case. This is the only game that screws with your iframes through a stat you have to level up. For example, Dark Souls 1, your iframes are connected to your carry weight and what kind of roll you are doing. For a fat roll, you get 9 iframes. For a mid roll, you get 11 iframes. And for a fast roll, you get 13. In Dark Souls 2, at 85 agility, you get 5 iframes. That's BS. And for max iframes, to which is 16 iframes, you need 116 agility. And for the same amount of iframes as a mid-roll from DS1, in Dark Souls 2, you need 96 agility. That's stupid, and I hate it. It's janky, and it's just a good starting point to show the F the player attitude this game values so much. Don't get me wrong, Dark Souls 1 iframes with its weight isn't perfect either, but at least it's usable. But let's be honest, if you're fat rolling, you're probably a guard based build anyway. But in Dark Souls 2, you start off feeling cheated because you will roll and know you dodge the attack and still take damage. It is ridiculous. So you immediately have to focus on adaptability before you can focus on molding your build to your playstyle. I hate it. Although, On the bright side, this game throws levels at you like crazy. Playing through this game and the DLC, you'll probably finish at over 200 unless you're doing a build based on the multiplayer standard people go by. Like Dark Souls 3, people usually stop at around 120, from my knowledge at least. But one thing that usually makes these games so beloved is how fair and balanced everything is. It's not because it's difficult, it's because it's a fair challenge that feels exhilarating when you overcome the obstacle or wall you hit, or defeat a boss who keeps kicking you around. But no, the developers saw the marketing of Prepare to Die and how people talk about Dark Souls on how difficult the game is. The team at FromSoft missed the point of fair difficulty. Their idea of hard was more is harder. They figured if you throw more enemies or more bosses or gang squads, it's harder. And they're just wrong. It makes the game unfair and unbalanced, and I'm sorry, this game is unbalanced and unfair in some areas. Granted, yes, in my opinion, Dark Souls 2 Scholar of the First Sin Edition is the easiest game in From Software's catalog, ignoring Demon's Souls. I haven't played that game, like I said. But they do some stupid stuff, like when you get to the Lost Bastille, there's a door with an enemy in stone. When you open that door, like 6 enemies come booking it out the door. Like, that's not fair, that's not challenging, that's artificial difficulty. Or how about this perfect example of this game's screw the player attitude is a shortcut in the Lost Bastille. There's a shortcut to the fight with the Ruined Sentinels, where they want you to jump from a higher platform down through a door. Like, that's just a sick joke. And how many times can you make bosses with several bosses? You have 3 Ruined Sentinels, you have the Skeleton Lords, the Executioner Chariot with the several enemies, Royal Rat Vanguard is basically a swarm of rats with a rat that's got a mohawk, the Royal Rat Authority, Duke's Deer Freya with the spiders, you got Twin Dragon Riders, the group Prowling Magus and Congregation, even though they're a joke, Belfry Gargoyles, which I'ma complain more about later, and more. So yeah, this game has terrible case of more means hard. You can't assume that making 2 bosses means it's on par with Ornstein and Smo. But I'm gonna have a whole section in this video discussing bosses and my take on this game's approach. The reason everyone loves Dark Souls 1 was because Miyazaki has an approach to difficulty where the reason the games are hard is to make the worlds believable. A quote when talking about Dark Souls 3, he said, "When you think about it, the difficulty in the Dark Souls franchise so far has been something that players have eventually been able to overcome. So when I show concern to the development team members, that's why the term I use is unreasonable. Basically, we don't want to go too far. It's about striking a balance." When he was discussing the creation of Dark Souls 3 after Dark Souls 2, he says, "My preference is to return to something structurally a little more like the first game, and Bloodborne, with the world a bit more connected. These games are meant to be built on balance. The game should coexist with the player. The game shouldn't be designed to destroy the player, but exist with the player. In my opinion, you should be overcoming the world and its obstacles, not feel like you're overcoming the developers and their BS. I hope that made sense, because I feel like Dark Souls 2 misses the mark on that. So let's discuss combat, controls, and enemy AI. That's what you spend your time doing in this game, right? And again, they somehow made the game control worse and made the enemies work worse too. So let's dive into it. So earlier, I was complaining about the dodge mechanics and the iframes, but to make the whole situation worse, the dodge rolls are kinda unresponsive. Not terrible, but not pinpoint either like the rest of the series. For some reason, there's a slight delay from when you press the dodge button to when you begin to dodge roll, causing a weird laggy or even heaviness to your character. It takes quite a while to get used to, but however, you do get used to it. But there shouldn't be a delay to get used to. But I don't understand. Like, how did that even happen? Dark Souls 1 was super responsive. I feel like attacks feel sluggish, even with the fastest weapons. The worst offender of this is the dex weapon type called Twin Blades. From the time you press attack and the animation lands into the attack, you can make a damn sandwich. Now hear me out. I know Dark Souls is slow and methodical, and I like that. Obviously, I'm okay with that. It's what I like about Dark Souls. But this is not slow and methodical. Some of the weapons feel slow and unresponsive. You know what I mean? I hope so. I originally started this playthrough as a dex build, still finished as one. I wanted to focus on speed, but I never felt like the weapons were fast enough to deliver enough DPS to justify not just using a stronger weapon. So I landed on the dex scaling curved greatsword, Murakuma. I can't pronounce it. It's fast and powerful, but it's a bit janky. You can spin while attacking, causing sometimes missing my attacks, but I got used to it and really liked the weapon. But let's talk about one of the artificial difficulty things that they program enemies to do, and a few janky things as well. But these enemies can just rotate. You can dodge an attack and the freaking enemy will rotate around to hit you anyway. The feet won't even move. It's like they are on a turntable. That's not fair difficulty. That's artificial difficulty. How are you supposed to trust attack patterns and wind up animations if they can just rotate rotate on axis and hit you anyway. That's what the other Soulsborne games do. Once an animation starts, it locks the enemy or player into the animation. No rotating, no animation canceling, nothing. You have to commit to the motion, but everyone and everything follows the same rules. But in this game, it feels like the enemies follow their own rules, and the player follows their own rules. And the rules are in favor of the enemy, not balanced like other Souls titles for artificial difficulty. This game hates the player, and it shows. Enemy placement is also a problem. They overwhelm the player with enemies and make some runbacks to bosses absolutely miserable. For me, in the base game, not the DLC, the worst runback has always been Iron Keep runback to Smelter Demon. I've always struggled with the attack patterns of the Outlaw Knights, and they throw so many at you, and a ton of them at a distance shooting big great arrows, so it becomes time consuming and it's nearly impossible to run past them. Just a little rant, but it helped make a point. I think if we talk about the whole game, including DLC though, the worst runback is to the second Smelter Demon in Crown of the Old Iron King. It's awful. Or how about the run back to Sir Aulon? And the worst at the player moment is all of Frigid Outskirts run back. Like, why does it exist? And on to some of the jank. Hitboxes are a mess. Don't get me wrong, Dark Souls 1 isn't perfect, and neither is any of the From Software games. It's impossible to be perfect, but this game is the worst offender. Now, I know the point of this video has been to mostly discuss the base game, but Sir Aulon and his magnetic frickin' sword is the absolute perfect example of the broken hitboxes. But hitboxes are a problem throughout this entire game. I can't count how many times I yelled at the TV in confusion. How about the hitbox of the Ancient Dragon's attack where it flies into the air and blows fire at the ground? You will run and run and run, and even if you don't see the fire, it hits you, and many other attacks. And movements during that fight are questionable damage. I could go on and on and on about the terrible hitboxes in this game, and honestly, that is part of what adds to the balance and fairness of these games, the extremely tight hitboxes. These are sloppy, but that could be partly due to the troubled development. Let's talk about From Software's bread and butter, boss fights. Everyone loves a great From Software boss fight. That is if you like Dark Souls games, or From Software games in general. The adrenaline, the back and forth between you and a boss, learning their attack patterns, their tells, and their weaknesses. Maybe it becomes a wall to overcome, but not an unfair wall, but a wall that's difficult to overcome in a balanced and challenging way. Let me be clear, not every boss has to be a Knight Artorias from DS1, or a Slave Knight Gale from DS3, or even a Fume Knight from DS2. Although, he also has a DS2 let's screw the player attitude with his Ashen Idols. If you don't have enough Smelter Wedges, there's areas of the arena that can heal the Fume Knight, otherwise a great boss fight. But damn, they could have cut the fat and taken out half these bosses, like Royal Rat Vanguard or Congregation, just to name a few. There's no need for 32 bosses. How about 20 fantastic, or even hell, 15 just downright great boss fights? Hell, most of the bosses in DS1 and DS3 are bangers. Except Diggykins. Dark Souls 1 had 22 bosses, and a lot of them, of course, not all, but a majority of them were great bosses, and they leave impressions on you because they were able to tune them to be what they are. Granted, not every boss is perfect. Look at Ceaseless Discharge, it's a joke of a boss. Or how about Centipede Demon, it's a terrible boss as well. With its giant lava pit, small islands, and giant boss, it's just not a good combo. But most of the fights are great. Sadly, most of DS2 bosses are not great. They just feel uninspired, bland, and some even unfair. Thing is, quantity is not better than quality, and they shot for quantity. Oh hey, the player base loves bosses, so what should we give them? Is even more bosses. And on paper that sounds great, but in practice it's not great. And back on the F the player attitude and quantity over quality, let's take a look at Belfry Gargoyles. I hate them, and they shouldn't exist. And yes, I'm aware that the 4 Kings in DS1 is similar, where if you take too long to finish the boss, you can have up to 4 Kings in the boss arena, and even that I'm not a fan of. But their health pools are small. The Gargoyles feel like their health pool is too large on purpose to make it so you definitely have a ton of gargoyles to fight, and it doesn't feel balanced. And yes, 4 Kings lack a bit of balance as well. I can see your argument, and you wouldn't be wrong. But why did we need a reskin of the Bell Gargoyles from the first game anyway? Just like why did we need a reskin of Ornstein? Also, the first fight with the Dragon Rider sucked. So why do I need to have a threesome with 2 Dragon Riders, with one up on top shooting arrows for a little while until he decides it's his turn to penetrate my anal canal? The fight was bland and again uninspired. By the way, yes, I know Dark Souls 1 also reuses the Asylum Demon, not once, not twice, but 3 times. However, in my personal opinion, each fight is different, and in a way, it feels like there's a breed of demons that are used as guards in Lordran. I don't mind the reuse, especially seeing each fight is different mechanically. Then again, in Dark Souls, we get awesome boss fights, like aesthetically, visually, and mechanically. I love the fight with the Guardian Dragon. I just think the dragon is beautiful, the light licking the cage, while this caged creature is aggressively trying to kill me. I don't know, it sticks out to me. I like it a lot. But on the other end of the spectrum, you get the opposite of a Dark Souls fight, with an old Zelda-like boss fight with Old Iron King, where you can only attack him when he smacks the ground and waits for you to batter his arm. That's just not how Dark Souls bosses should work. Dark Souls bosses are about trading blows, learning attack patterns, and attacking when you got the opening between attacks. Not a boss who does an attack showing you its weak spot and letting you hit it while it stands around. That's a lesser boss design in my opinion. Then you have the Old Iron King's Hole of Doom. Damn thing has a gravitational pull of 3 planets. Its mesmerizing vacuum pulls you in. No one likes it. Just like no one likes the hypnotic pull of the Bed of Chaos's many holes. I guess nothing was learned. And spoilers, I'm about to talk about the last boss for a sec. I'll leave a timestamp on the screen for when I'm done talking about it, okay? So, 3, 2, 1. The end boss, Throne Watcher and Throne Defender, and the boss with the 2 Dragon Riders are a great example of what Ornstein and Smode perfected, was you can't have 2 bosses being aggressive and attacking at the same time so frequently. With Ornstein and Smode, you have a passive and an aggressive, normally not both. You have a slow Smo and a fast Ornstein. You have pillars to use to split them up and get them separate for moments of one-on-one. Then when you kill one, you get a super boss. That's what made the challenge so fair and the boss so memorable. Not saying that when you kill one, the other should do the same thing. No, because then you're just repeating. But obviously they are trying to capture the same magic, but missed the point entirely. Instead it's, oh, 2 is harder than 1, right? That's why everyone likes it, right? 2 is better than 1? Quality is better than quantity, like we already discussed. But Throne Watcher and Throne Defender feels like they're both always attacking either right at the same time or one directly after the other, leaving no way to dodge and getting nipped at the end of a dodge. There's almost no way to separate them. It's just another half-hearted attempt at a duel like Ornstein and Smo, I feel like. The Ruined Sentinels kind of do an okay job at doing a 3-way boss fight, where if you stay up on top, you can usually get one at a time. And somewhat, if you fight them at the same time, their attacking time and an aggression is easier to manage, but I wouldn't say it's a good boss fight. It's just another gang squad. And you have just flat out poor, bland, and crappy boss fights like Covetous Demon that barely fights back. You could order a coffee at Dunkin' Donuts in the time that it winds up and attacks you. Royal Rat Vanguard is nothing special, just a rat infestation and you're the exterminator. And why does a congregation even exist? Like, for real? But there is some really good boss fights in this game. Like, I really enjoy the Pursuer. It's a genuinely enjoyable boss fight and continues to be enjoyable every time he pops up. Maybe it starts to feel a little repetitive, but I enjoyed his company. I consider him a friend. Looking Glass Knight is definitely one of my favorites from this game, aesthetically and mechanically, and I don't find the summoning of enemies to feel too unfair, because Looking Glass Knight becomes very passive during the time the extra enemies in the arena. I would have enjoyed Smelter Demon more if they didn't think that they needed to add the F the player mechanic, where if you stand near him, he hurts you when he's buffed. Felstad is a really fun boss fight and feels important as well, and Lost Sinner is eerie and creepy, and there's 2 forms to this fight. One where the arena is dark and you can't lock on, or another if you kill the gargoyles and get the Lost Bastille key and light the oil tracks on each side of causing the arena to light up and you can lock on. It's an enjoyable boss fight, and Dark Lurker is really good as well, but in the base game these are the only boss fights that I feel stand up to any of the best boss fights in the rest of the series, and that really goes to show they didn't understand what makes a boss fight great. I don't know if y'all are gonna agree or disagree, but again, this whole section is based on my opinion. I do think there's some other bosses that are good boss fights, like some honorable mentions are Covetous Demon. Wait, whoa, wait a minute, where's my common sense? I meant to say the Rotten. Flexile Sentry, Old Dragon Slayer, he's an honorable mention because he's just an Ornstein clone. Reused. But yeah, I don't know, these boss fights could have been better, and Bloodborne and Dark Souls 3 prove that. It's a case of not understanding what makes boss fights great in my opinion. Why else does Dark Souls 3 and Bloodborne have so many knockouts and downright mind-blowing boss fights, and Dark Souls 1 also right before it? So alright, I think we've discussed what makes it the weakest Dark Souls, but how does it stand up on its own? Well, honestly, it's a great game. It's still a Souls game. Its DNA is still there. That still puts it above so many other games out there. It's a lower tier Souls-like, below the likes of Nioh, but still above Lords of the Fallen, and above many non-Souls-like AAA games. It's a deep RPG with great Souls combat, deep RPG mechanics, lots of replayability, trying new builds and new Game Plus modes where the difficulty scales upwards every new Game Plus up to 8 times. Including the first playthrough, there's so many different weapons, spells, miracles, pyromancies and options to try, so much content. It's far from a boring game. I highly recommend playing it, but for the love of God, don't start your Souls adventure here. It will give you the wrong impression of what a Souls game feels like, plays like, looks like. I think the best starting point to get into the Souls series is 3, because it's a very accessible version of the Souls-like. If you want to be a purist, then start with Dark Souls 1. Again, I don't know about Demon Souls, I've not played it. But yes, Dark Souls 2 is a great game, not a great Souls game. In no way was I sending hate towards this game. I love it, just wish it was better as a Souls fan. And as a Souls fan, I see the potential this game had, but it was cursed by poor management, troubled development, and not great direction, and a bit too aggressive on the let's make it hard for the sake of being hard, and gotcha moments when it decides to say F the player.